All right, hello. So today what we're going to do is we're going to look at two more examples of absolute monarchies. We're going to look at Prussia first and then Russia after that. Now, I know their names sound really similar, but they're actually completely unrelated, and don't get them mixed up as we go through this. All right, so let's do some contextualization, and we're going to start with Prussia. So Prussia was actually made up of two different states. So there was Brandenburg, which is in what is today northeastern Germany, and then there was Prussia proper, which was further east, and it's in modern-day Poland. So we've got Brandenburg over here, and then some additional territories here, and then we've got Prussia over here on the right. So they're actually part of the Holy Roman Empire, and before they become independent from the Holy Roman Empire, you'll see this territory called Brandenburg Prussia, so they'll hyphenate the names, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call them Prussia as we go through this. Now, while these states were united politically, you can see there from the map, right, that they're not actually next to each other, so they're non-contiguous. And as I mentioned, they were part of the Holy Roman Empire, and they were really flat. This area was sandy. It was really difficult to defend. There weren't a lot of mountains that would protect them from invading armies. And as we're going to see, these geographical facts are going to shape their development. And even though this area is part of the Holy Roman Empire, they are ruled by their own dynasty, and that is called the Hohenzollerns. All right. So just like with France, the 30 Years' War is going to shape how Prussia becomes an absolute monarchy. So Prussia was actually devastated by the 30 Years' War. So their economy was in shambles, and they lost 50% of their population, which is insane, right? But even though they were really devastated and left really sort of struggling, they did get some advantages, oddly enough. So the ruler of Prussia was called the Elector. And this person was one of the 7 German princes who was able to elect the Holy Roman Emperor. So he and the other German princes would get together, and theoretically they had control over who became the emperor. So what that did, they didn't actually have that much control over who became the emperor. It was always going to be a Habsburg. But still, that position was really powerful, and it gave Prussia a lot of clout within the Holy Roman Empire. Moreover, Prussia was not Catholic like the Habsburgs. They were Protestant. So the Hohenzollerns were actually Calvinists, and there are a lot of Lutherans living there as well. And as we know from last unit, becoming Protestant was kind of a way to assert your power against the Holy Roman Emperor. So we see with Prussia here that they're part of the Holy Roman Empire, but they have a lot of power within the Holy Roman Empire, and it's going to be pretty easy for them to push back and eventually become independent. And they really don't face any problems from becoming independent. The Holy Roman Empire does not try and get them back. Now, sort of at the end of the 30 Years' War, and then in the decades that followed, they are ruled by someone named Frederick William, nicknamed the Great Elector. Now, one thing that's really confusing about Prussian history, and it's going to be this way for the entire course, they continue this pattern forever, they really like the names Frederick, and they really like the name William. So literally every important Prussian ruler is going to be either a Frederick William, a Frederick, or a William. It gets very confusing. So don't get we're going to talk about 2 different Frederick Williams today. Don't get them mixed up. So I'll be using their titles and nicknames as much as I can. So the Great Elector, as we'll call him, wasn't actually an absolute monarch, because as you can tell from his title, when he's in charge of Prussia, it's still part of the Holy Roman Empire. But what he's going to do is he's going to, again, lay that foundation for an independent Prussia and for an absolute monarchy. And what he's really famous for is for building a really strong standing army. So I mentioned that Prussia is really hard to defend. They lost a lot of their population in the 30 Years' War. The Great Elector, Frederick William, is really going to take this to heart, and he's really going to prioritize building up Prussia's military strength. And actually, through when Prussia ceases to exist in the 20th century, they're going to be really known for their military might. All right. So Frederick William, the Great Elector, is actually going to break from, or he's not, again, as we mentioned, he's not really an absolute monarch, not only because he's not really a monarch at all, but he doesn't really follow all of the practices that we associate with absolute monarchy from last lecture. So he's actually pretty religiously tolerant. So even though he's a Calvinist, he allows Lutherans and Catholics to practice their faith freely, although he doesn't extend that religious toleration to Jewish people. So yeah, Germany has that problem for a long, long time. Frederick William is going to limit the power of the nobility, though. So it does bring him in line with some other absolute monarchs that we know about, right? And the Prussian nobility is called the Junkers. I know that looks like Junkers, but they're Germans. They say things differently. So what he does is he limits their power in the parliament of Prussia, but he does grant them a lot of perks. So he's using kind of that carrot stick tactic that we saw with Louis last lecture, right? So he gives them high-ranking positions in the military and the bureaucracy. He gives them a lot of control over the peasants. We mentioned that serfdom's on the decline in Europe, but it's going to kind of come back a little bit in Prussia for a little bit. And he also exempted the nobles from taxes, which of course they're very happy about, right? In terms of economic policy, he kind of realizes some of those characteristics of absolutism because he was also a mercantilist, so he's really focused on increasing exports, and he does boost the Prussian economy quite a lot. Now, the real absolute monarch in Prussia is actually the son of the Great Elector, and this is King Frederick William I, right? So you can see just from his name, he is the one who allows Prussia to become independent, mostly, sort of, from the Holy Roman Empire. So he is king in Prussia, right? So he is in charge of his people. And what he does is he continues his father's policies and increases them. So he's an actual absolute monarch, and he's really, really known for taking what his dad did with the military and taking it one step further. So he develops this really powerful militaristic absolutist state, and that's bolded because that term means like it is a state that is centered around the military. They're known for their military might. And so there's a famous quote about Prussia, which is that Prussia is not a state that possesses an army, but an army that possesses a state. All right, so we're going to turn our attention away from Prussia, and we're going to look at Russia, who we have not talked about at all yet. And so what we need to do is there's a lot of backstory about Russia that I need to get you guys caught up on. So until the late 1400s, so when the rest of Europe is undergoing the Renaissance, Russia is actually dominated by the Mongol Empire, believe it or not. And so what that does is it cuts them off from the rest of Europe. So Mongol rule starts like in the Middle Ages, and again, it doesn't really collapse until the late 1400s. So this fact, plus the fact that Russia is really far away from everybody else, they're furthest, or pretty much as far east as you can go in Europe before you get to Asia, it leads Russia to develop a little bit differently than the rest of Western Europe. So again, they don't experience the Renaissance because for big parts of the Renaissance, they're under Mongol control. And again, they're just far away. They retain feudalism in a really extreme form, so feudalism / serfdom, same thing, a lot longer than Western Europe. So they're actually not going to abolish serfdom until the mid-1800s. So like when the United States is abolishing slavery, that's when Russia's going to get rid of serfdom, just to put that in perspective. And because Russia has this really strong tradition of serfdom during this time, they don't really have a super strong middle class. So there's not really like a big merchant class like we would see in Italy or in France or in parts of the Holy Roman Empire. And in terms of religion, they aren't part of this whole Protestant Catholic fight. They're Eastern Orthodox. So they're doing their own thing. They're still Christian. They're just a different branch of Christianity. But because they're outside of that Catholic Protestant sort of dichotomy there, they don't experience the Reformation. They don't participate in the wars of religion. So again, they're kind of doing their own thing. All right, in terms of political history, so they become independent from the Mongols. Then in the 1500s, we see one of the most famous Russian leaders, and this is Ivan the Terrible. And he is the first Russian leader to call himself Tsar. So Tsar is really just the Russian form of emperor. So he's basically the first person to say, hey, I'm an emperor, I'm in charge, right? And he's actually a lot like the new monarchs in that he really goes after the nobles and tries to enhance his own power. So he's really famous for crushing a revolt of the Russian nobility, kind of like actually what Mazarin did with the nobles in France. And the Russian nobles are called the boyars. The problem is, though, Ivan the Terrible dies without an heir. That's actually because he murdered his heir by accident. Don't ask. And you can ask. It's kind of funny, actually. And sad. Which launches a big succession crisis. And what that leads to is we actually see the rise of a different royal family in Russia. So Ivan is part of this family called the Rurikids. He dies. There's a succession crisis. And then we see a new royal family start to call themselves czars. And these are the Romanovs. And they're going to last up until the 20th century. So quite a long time. So bottom line here is that Russia has actually, even though they have a really different sort of cultural history than the rest of Western Europe, there's a lot of similarities in terms of political history. There's a lot of chaos, and there's a lot of tension between the monarch and between the nobility. So actually a lot like France, which is actually going to lead to probably why they're an absolute monarchy. Okay, so the absolute monarch that we need to know is Peter the Great. So there he is, and just take a second to look at him there and look how different he looks from Ivan the Terrible. So I'm going to skip back for just a second. There's Ivan. There's Peter. So you can kind of see like what Peter's priority is going to be just based on the way he dresses, right? So his whole shtick is that he is kind of insecure about Russia, and he believes that Russia is like behind Western Europe and it needs to catch up. So he actually goes on this grand world tour of Western Europe when he becomes czar, and he looks at Europe and he's like, all right, I need to make Russia more like Western Europe. And so that's his goal. So a lot of this has to do actually, so what he's going to do, he's going to do political and military changes first. So he's going to build this Western style standing army and a navy. That's really important to him. He's really interested in navies. He's also going to reorganize the bureaucracy. So Russia has government officials, but they're not really well organized. And what Peter the Great does is he establishes this thing called the Table of Ranks, which really just listed out all the positions you could hold within the military and within the government and like what you had to do to be a part of that position, right? He also, he really tried to make the nobles more let's say like professional. He required them to serve in either the military or the bureaucracy. He didn't like them just like chilling with their serfs and getting, partying and getting drunk or whatever the heck they were doing. So again, kind of like what Louis did is he kept them occupied, right? And he allowed actually for some social mobility. So he allowed people who were non-nobles, so like serfs potentially if they became free, to become noble through their service. So what that does is it builds sort of like this group of people who are really, really loyal to him. In terms of economic changes, he's also going to continue that sort of absolutist tradition of embracing mercantilism. But like with Louis XIV in France, he spent a lot more than he could take in through his economic policy, which is going to lead to him, like Louis, raising taxes on the peasants. Again, not really effective. They don't have a lot of money. It's not going to make them happy. And then also, as we mentioned, right, he's really interested in making Russia culturally more like Western Europe. So what he's going to do is he's actually going to change, first of all, actually gender roles in Russia. So like during this time, Russian women, they wore head coverings. Noble women actually lived apart from noble men, so they didn't really interact that much. And what Peter the Great, he's going to end that. He's also going to require of his nobles like Western style dress and manners and like personal grooming. So what he does is he imposes a literal beard tax. So like traditionally Russian men would have really long beards, and Peter the Great is like, no. In Western Europe, they have like little tiny beards or they're clean shaven. So he taxed nobles if they had long beards, which is what you can see in this picture here. So there's some sort of agent, one of these government officials of Peter cutting off this dude's beard. And you can see they're dressed differently, right? This guy's more Russian, more traditionally Russian. This guy is more sort of Western European style. All right. And the final thing that he's going to do is actually, again, this is also a lot like Louis. He's going to move his capital. Louis didn't, of course, he didn't really move the official capital. The official capital is still in Paris, but he's going to move folks to Versailles, right? And Peter does something kind of similar. He moves the official capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Yes, he did name it after himself. And this was this Western style port city. It's in sort of northern Russia on the North Sea. And what that's going to do is it's really important from a strategic and trade perspective because it gives him access to Western Europe. So he can send ships out to go trade with Western Europe, to go fight Western Europe, whatever he wants to do. And actually, he was really inspired by Versailles, which he visited. And then the city is like also full of these canals, which are inspired by Amsterdam, which is in the Dutch Republic. So really inspired sort of visually by Western Europe as well. Although again, he's an absolute monarch. So who does he get to build this new city? Serfs! So it's built essentially through slave labor. So again, we're a lot of top-down power here.